I want to describe what the code actually is, because the description in the newspapers and the description the studios offer is not accurate. The code is presented as a list of moral standards that the film industry voluntarily adopted to protect audiences, particularly children, from harmful content. This is true in the sense that the code contains a list of moral standards. It is not true in the sense that the adoption was voluntary or that protecting audiences was the primary motivation. The code is a cartel agreement. The major studios agreed not to show certain content because showing that content would bring government regulation. Government regulation would mean the government had control over what could be shown. The studios wanted control over what could be shown. Therefore, self-regulation. The morality? Real in some cases. The studios genuinely believed some of what the code prohibited was harmful. The morality? Also strategic. The specific content of the code was shaped by what needed to be prohibited to satisfy the Catholic Church, specifically the Legion of Decency and the Protestant groups that were threatening to lobby Congress for censorship. The code. A negotiated settlement between the studios and the religious groups that were threatening to destroy their business. Dressed as ethics. Will H. Hayes, appointed head of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America in 1922, in the wake of the Arbuckle scandal. A former Postmaster General and Republican Party chairman. His specific function? To be the respectable face of the film industry. To reassure Congress and the public that the industry was being managed by a serious man with serious values. Hayes did not write the code. He presided over the organization that eventually adopted it. Joseph Breen, the man who actually ran the Production Code Administration from 1934 onward. Breen was the code's enforcer, the man who read scripts, demanded changes, approved or rejected finished films. Breen was a Catholic with the specific worldview of a 1930s conservative Catholic. Deep suspicion of sexuality, deep suspicion of Jews, specific ideas about the hierarchy of races and the proper place of women. The code's actual enforcement shaped by Breen's worldview. This is not incidental. The code prohibited certain sexual content. Breen's enforcement of that prohibition was harsher on some studios, specifically the studios run by Jewish producers, than on others. The code prohibited depictions of interracial relationships. Breen's specific sensitivity about race went beyond the written code. The code, a document. Breen, the man who applied it with his own specific biases. The difference between the written code and its enforcement, Breen. The production code was written in 1930 by a Jesuit priest named Daniel Lord and a Catholic publisher named Martin Quigley. The specific prohibitions? No film could show crime in a way that made it sympathetic or instructed the audience in how to commit it. No film could show illegal drug use. No film could depict sexual perversion, which in practice meant homosexuality. No film could show nudity or lustful kissing. No film could mock religion or clergy. No film could show miscegenation, relationships between people of different races. No film could show childbirth. No film could ridicule any nation, race, or creed in a way that might cause ill will. The villains of crime films had to be punished. The good had to triumph, or at least the evil could not be seen to triumph. These prohibitions? Real. Enforced. The specific mechanism through which every film I described in the film series had to navigate. I described throughout that series how filmmakers worked within and around the code, how Double Indemnity killed its protagonist to satisfy the requirement that crime not pay while making you feel the tragedy. How Some Like It Hot received no code seal and was released anyway. The code, not impermeable, but real, present, shaping what could be shown and said. The code was written in 1930, but not meaningfully enforced until 1934. The 4 years between? The pre-code era. The pre-code films. I want to describe what they showed, because the contrast with the post-1934 code films is the clearest way to understand what the code actually changed. Pre-code films showed women who had sex outside marriage and were not punished for it. In Red-Headed Woman, 1932, Jean Harlow plays a woman who sleeps her way to wealth and success, and at the end is living in Paris with a rich lover. No punishment, no remorse. Men who were criminals and who were treated with complexity rather than condemnation. The gangster films of 1930 to 1933, Little Caesar, The Public Enemy, Scarface, showed criminals as people with comprehensible motivations, with charm, with the specific appeal of someone who has refused to accept the limitations the world has imposed. Drug use, homosexuality, implied or sometimes explicit, prostitution, violence without the specific moral framing that the code would require. The pre-code films, not better than the post-code films in all respects, but honest in ways that the code made impossible. The code did not make films more moral. It made films less honest. The Legion of Decency was organized by the Catholic Church in 1933. The specific mechanism, Catholics were asked to sign a pledge, the Legion of Decency Pledge, committing not to attend films that the Legion condemned. The pledge was signed by millions of American Catholics. The studios understood what this meant. Millions of Americans agreeing not to attend their films unless the films met the Legion's standards. The specific financial calculation? If the Catholic audience, approximately 20% of the American population, boycotted films en masse, the financial damage would be severe. The studios did the math. The math said, enforce the code. The code was written in 1930 and not enforced. The Legion of Decency was organized in 1933. The code was enforced from July 1934. The connection, not coincidental. The code was enforced not because studio executives had a moral awakening in July 1934. The code was enforced because the Legion of Decency made non-enforcement financially unacceptable. This is the specific mechanism I want to describe. The code was not a moral document. It was a business response to a specific financial threat. I am an actress. I think about roles. I want to describe what the code did to specific kinds of stories. The stories it made impossible to tell honestly. The story of a gay person, impossible under the code. Homosexuality was sexual perversion and could not be depicted. The specific human experience of gay people, which existed, which was real, which was part of the world the films were supposedly depicting, erased. The story of an interracial relationship, impossible. Miscegenation was prohibited. The specific human experience of love across racial lines, which existed, which was real, erased. The story of a woman who made choices and was not punished for them, severely constrained. The code did not explicitly prohibit this, but the requirement that crime and sin be punished was applied to women's sexual choices in ways it was not applied to men's. The red-headed woman who lived happily in Paris? Impossible after 1934. The story of a criminal who was complex rather than condemned, constrained. Criminals had to be punished. The specific complexity of the pre-code gangster film, the figure who is simultaneously appealing and destructive, reduced to the requirement that he die at the end. These are not small losses. The stories that could not be told. Real human experiences that the cinema was not permitted to depict honestly. The code did not protect audiences. It protected specific audiences from the specific discomfort of seeing themselves, or people unlike themselves, depicted with honesty. I want to be fair. The code produced something. The specific thing it produced, a set of constraints that forced filmmakers to find indirect ways to say what they could not say directly. The double entendre, the implication, the shadow instead of the act. I describe this throughout the film series. The horse racing scene in The Big Sleep, the cigarette gesture in Now Voyager, the shadows in Double Indemnity. These are not worse than direct depiction would have been. They are different, sometimes better. The implication is more powerful than the explicit. The shadow is more frightening than the monster. The cigarette is more intimate than what the cigarette stands for. The code, by prohibiting direct expression, forced the development of a cinematic language of indirection that has its own specific beauty and power. This is real. I do not want to say the code was entirely without value as an aesthetic constraint. I want to say the aesthetic value was not its purpose, and the stories it made impossible were real losses, and the people whose experiences it erased were real people. Both. I said Breen had specific views about Jews. I want to describe this more precisely because it is uncomfortable and because it is documented. Joseph Breen wrote, in private correspondence, specifically anti-Semitic statements about the studio executives he dealt with. He described Hollywood as controlled by Jews who were using the film industry to corrupt American values. He used specific derogatory language. This is documented. The letters exist. The man who enforced the code, who decided which films received the seal of approval that allowed them to be distributed, held these views. The specific effect? Studios run by Jewish producers, which was most of the major studios, found their films subjected to particular scrutiny. The code's enforcement was not uniform. The studios that were not run by Jewish producers found the process somewhat easier to navigate. This is difficult to quantify. The code was also enforced against non-Jewish studios, but the man who enforced it was not neutral. He brought his specific worldview to the enforcement. The code, presented as objective standards applied uniformly. The enforcement? Not uniform. Applied by a specific man with specific views. This is the gap between the stated purpose and the actual operation that runs through this entire series. I want to describe how specific films navigated the code, because the navigation is where the specific intelligence of filmmakers is most visible. Double Indemnity. Walter Neff and Phyllis Dietrichson's affair is explicit in Kane's novel. In the film, suggested. The specific suggestions, the ankle bracelet, the double meaning of the dialogue, are more effective than the explicit would have been. Wilder used the code's restriction to develop a language of implication that the novel could not achieve. The Big Sleep. I described the horse racing scene. Every sexual exchange in the film is conducted in language that the code could not object to because the language was ostensibly about something else. The brilliance? Chandler, Faulkner, and Hawks developed the double entendre into an art form because they had to. Rope, 1948. Hitchcock made a film with two murderers who are implicitly gay. The code prohibited depicting homosexuality. The film does not depict it explicitly. It implies it so clearly that everyone who sees the film understands it. The code, technically satisfied. The subject, fully present. The implication, better than the explicit would have been. The audience's recognition of the implication, the specific pleasure of understanding what is not being said, is a form of engagement that direct depiction does not produce. The code accidentally produced the cinema of implication. The cinema of implication, one of the great achievements of American film. The specific irony: the code's attempt to suppress content produced a more sophisticated treatment of that content than would have existed without the suppression. The code's prohibition on miscegenation. I want to describe this specifically because it is the code's most serious moral failure. The prohibition. No film could depict a romantic or sexual relationship between people of different races. The specific effect. The experience of Black Americans, the largest racial minority, the group most directly affected by this prohibition, was systematically excluded from honest cinematic depiction. A Black man and a white woman could not be shown in a romantic relationship. A Black woman and a white man could not be shown in a romantic relationship. The specific human experience of interracial love erased. But the erasure went further. Because the code also shaped what could be depicted about Black characters generally, not through specific prohibitions, but through the general requirement that films not cause ill will among racial or national groups, which in practice meant that depictions of racial conflict were avoided. Racial conflict existed, was real, was shaping American society in ways that the cinema was not permitted to address honestly. The best years of our lives. I noted that the film did not include the experience of Black veterans. The code was not the only reason for this, but the code's specific racial architecture, the prohibition on miscegenation, the general caution about racial content, shaped what studios were willing to show. The specific cost? An entire generation of American films that depicted America without honestly depicting the racial reality of America. I want to describe the code's political dimension because it had one, and it is rarely discussed. The code prohibited films that depicted illegal behavior sympathetically. In the 1930s and 1940s, labor organizing was frequently conducted in ways that broke laws: anti-picketing laws, laws against assembly, the specific apparatus of laws designed to suppress union activity. Films sympathetic to labor organizing, the code could be and was used against them. Films critical of capitalism. The code could be and was used against them. The requirement that crime not pay, that wrongdoing be punished, applied to corporate wrongdoing in a way that made it difficult to depict corporate malfeasance sympathetically. The code, not an explicitly political document. The code operated in a political context and was applied in politically non-neutral ways. Films about workers, about the poor, about people who broke laws for economic survival. Subject to scrutiny that films about comfortable people were not subject to. The specific political effect: the code protected the status quo. Films that challenged the economic and social order were harder to make within it. This was not an accident. The code's authority eroded over the 1950s. Several specific events. The Supreme Court ruled in 1952, in Burstyn v. Wilson, that film was protected speech under the First Amendment. This meant that government censorship of film was unconstitutional, but it also undermined the code's justification as the industry's defense against government censorship. Some Like It Hot was released in 1959 without the code seal. United Artists distributed it. It was enormously successful. This demonstrated that the studios did not need the code's approval to release a film commercially. Television. As films increasingly competed with television, the studios found that the code constrained them from making films that television could not show, films with adult content that would draw audiences to theaters. The code began to work against the studio's commercial interests rather than for them. The code was eventually replaced by the rating system in 1968. The rating system, a different approach. Not prohibition, but classification. Films for adults could show adult content, the audience's choice, what they were willing to see. The code, over. what it had prevented from being shown honestly. Real, documented losses. What it had accidentally produced through the constraint. Also real. I am an actress. I have worked within the code my entire career. I want to describe what working within the code means in practice for an actress. The roles available to me, shaped by the code. The woman I can play, constrained by the requirement that women's sexuality be handled in specific ways, that independent women be punished or tamed, that the domestic resolution be available. The roles I cannot play. The woman who makes choices the code does not permit her to make and who is not punished for them. The woman whose sexuality is honest rather than implied or condemned. The woman in a relationship the code has decided is impermissible. The specific roles I would like to play. Some of them the code has made impossible. Not all of them. The code has not prevented me from playing complex women. Some Like It Hot happened. Dark Passage happened. The roles in the film series happened. The code shaped them, did not eliminate them. But the specific roles that would require the code to be absent, those I have not played. I notice the absence. I have noticed it for years. I want to describe the direct connection between the Arbuckle case and the Hays Code, because the connection is the point. The Hays Code was created in direct response to the Arbuckle scandal. The Hays office was created in direct response to the Arbuckle scandal. Hays was appointed in January 1922, 3 months after the first Arbuckle trial began. The specific logic? The public outrage about the Arbuckle case, constructed by the Hearst papers, amplified by the Legion of Decency's precursors, was the specific threat that the studios were responding to when they created the Hays office. The Arbuckle case produced the apparatus of the Hays office. The Hays office produced the code. The code shaped American cinema for 34 years. The chain. A party in San Francisco in 1921. A woman who died. A media campaign that constructed a myth. An industry response to manage the fallout from the myth. A self-censorship apparatus created by the industry response. A code that shaped cinema for a generation. The specific irony, the man who was innocent, who was acquitted, who the jury apologized to, is the man whose case produced the apparatus that governed the industry for decades. The myth produced the code. The code, real consequences. The origin, a lie. I want to ask the question directly. Is the Hays Code a scandal? The word scandal requires something hidden, something that, if known, would produce outrage. Is the code hidden? No. It is the most public document in Hollywood history. Is there something hidden about the code that, if known, would produce outrage? Yes. The hidden thing. The code was not a moral document. It was a business arrangement. The morality was the cover story for the specific commercial and political calculations of the studios. The hidden thing? The enforcement was not neutral. Breen applied the code with his own specific biases. The hidden thing? The code's racial architecture was not a moral achievement. It systematically excluded the honest depiction of race in American cinema at a moment when race was the central issue of American life. The hidden thing. The code was used to suppress political content as well as sexual content. These things, known to people in the industry, not known to the audiences who watched the films. Not the subject of public discussion. This is the specific quality of the code as scandal, not the dramatic scandal of a party at the St. Francis, but the quieter scandal of an institution that presented itself as moral and was something else. The Hays Code is the scandal that is not seen as a scandal because it was presented as morality, and the morality was real enough to obscure what the code was actually for. which was to protect the studios from government interference by giving the studios control over their own content, enforced by a man with specific biases that shaped what American cinema could show for 34 years, at the specific cost of erasing from the screen the honest depictions of sexuality, of race, of politics, of every kind of human experience that the studios decided was too dangerous to show. I have made my career within this system. I have found ways to work within it. I have also noticed what the system has not permitted me to do. The noticing. What this series is for. Come back next week. Ingrid Bergman, Roberto Rossellini, A Telegram from a Senator. The specific moment when America decided that a foreign actress's private life was the country's business. Come back.